Christian Feldbacher-Escamilla, and he's going to talk about defective information and abduction. I was just telling him that this is just great to have abducted people at the Institute. So welcome, and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for joining the talk. Also, thanks to the organizers for setting up this great event. So I'm speaking about defective information and abduction. And the problem I want to start with is that in scientific theory building, we very often rely on data which is defective in the sense that it contains errors. And then the question is, how should we deal with this? How should we get along with this? And there's basically two options. I mean, you can fine-tune this more, but so one is we should still aim at most accurately describe what's going on within our data. Or another option is to look out for better alternatives. And what I'm arguing here in this talk is that we should look out for better alternatives. And as I want to suggest, one such alternative is abductive reasoning. Okay. So perhaps the project can be described a little bit in the same line like Greg's talk this morning. So we have the effectiveness in science by, for example, in the sense of confusions. And we need to figure out frameworks how to deal with confusions. And that's what the semantics Greg was discussing today are about. And this is about effectiveness in data, with error in the data, and how should we best deal with this. That's discussed here. And the main idea will be that abductive inferences incorporate constraints on simplicity, and simplicity have a nice feature when it comes to errors in data. How exactly this works should become clear after I've listened to this talk. Okay, so I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I will provide a characterization of the notion of abduction I have in mind here. Then I will provide an argument for the epistemic validity of the ingredients of abductive inferences I'll put forward. And in the final part, I'll outline, I mean, I have lots of stuff on the slides, so I will rush over it a bit, I guess. I will outline how one can generalize the reasoning in the second part for the particular notion of simplicity and its epistemic value to other notions of simplicity, also used in abductive reasoning. Okay, so also here, whenever there is a question of understanding, just interrupt me. I'm happy to be interrupted. So let's start with the characterization. The characterization, I mean, the very rough picture is we have 3 main types of inference in science. We have deductive reasoning, which is truth preservation, which is based on the idea of truth preservation. We have inductive reasoning, which is uncleative, and the idea is that in inductive reasoning we do not really exceed the notions and the vocabulary that we start with in our premises. And then we have abductive inferences, which are also imperative, but the main idea is also that we introduce somehow new theories, hypotheses, notions. Okay, so we start with a set of notions like here, and we end up with a conclusion that contains different notions, and in a relevant sense, different notions. And important for science is that these 3 types of inferences are very successful, particularly when we combine them. So, for example, a standard procedure is to start with observation, and given your observation, you apply inductive reasoning and generalize. Given your generalizations, you do theory building and hypothesizing by help of abductive inferences. And then you try to make some explanations to deduce some stuff from your theories. And then you end up with new observations which verify or falsify your theory. Okay, so this is somehow a cycle which we find quite often in science, and which includes all this kind of reasoning, and which seems to make scientific reasoning particularly successful. Now let me just indicate abductive inference by help of a very famous example, namely Gregor Mendel's abductive inference on the laws of inheritance. And here the idea is basically, so Mendel also started with some kind of guided observations. So he tested about 5,000 tree plants, and he observed a particular pattern when he hybridized the plants. So for example, when he started with 50% white and 50% red pea plants, in the first generation, and when he hybridized them, he ended up, for example, with a pattern like this. So all the daughter generation plants were red ones. But then in the next daughter generation, the second daughter generation, the white ones popped up again. And the question is somehow how can this happen if the white feature became extinct in the second round? And there he hypothesized that given this observational structure, we have red and white, we need to introduce some kind of theoretical notions. So he introduced the notions of recessive, dominant traits and mixed traits. Okay, and then the idea is that behind this observational structure there is a more deeper structure going on. So we have purely white traits, we have purely red traits, and we have mixed traits. And particularly if you mix red and white, then you end up with mixed traits. Okay. And these traits have this feature that one property is dominant, one is recessive. So for example, white is recessive. It doesn't show up on the phenomenological level, but red is dominant. It shows up on the phenomenological level. But what's behind in the deeper structure of the problem, let's say, is the mixed trait. So the white portion is still somehow preserved. And then if we go on to the next round, we will end up with some cases where the recessive part is inherited from both parts, and that's why white comes back again. Okay? And so the main idea is you start with observational basis that contains properties like red and white, and you end up with a theory by abductive inference, which has theoretical notions like recessive, dominant, and mixed traits. So that's a very famous application. Yeah.
But you consider this a result of abduction?
This is a particular form of abduction.
Well, that's purely informative. But how do you get to this notion of recessive and how do you get them from your observational data?
Yeah.
You didn't say anything about it
No.
yet, right?
No, that's and that's basically that form of abduction. I'm not that much interested here. This will come at the end of the talk. That's called creative abduction. You invent new hypotheses, and here I mean what's going on in the modern debate is people relate this to, for example, I don't know, causal search procedures, which should somehow single out particular theoretical structures, but it doesn't say, for example, that this structure needs to be a recessive or a dominant one, or so. It's just you can distinguish more stuff on the background level than on the observation. Okay. Thank you. So that's a so-called creative abductive inference. But what I'm more interested in is so-called selective abductive inference, and that's what you basically know perhaps by the term inference to the best explanation. And there the idea is we do not really look out for this alternative hypothesis, but we have them already at a given preset. Okay. So like Mendel's, he has something like his data and he constructs a hypothesis. And in the selective abductive case, you assume there is already a set of alternative hypotheses. And that's the more interesting part of abductive inference for this talk. And the task is that given a set of alternative hypotheses which explain a phenomenon, an empirical phenomenon, you should choose that hypothesis which is the best one, which does the best job in doing this explanation. And what does best mean here? I mean, there's various answers out in the literature, but one seems one canon of an interpretation of best explanation seems to be at least two criteria. So first of all, you should somehow maximize the likelihood of the data given the hypothesis. So the idea is the explanation which makes the data that you observe most probable is the best one in this respect. And another ingredient is you should opt for that hypothesis which maximizes simplicity, or negatively put, which minimizes complexity. So just for simplicity, for the remainder of this talk, recall we have two ingredients. We have the likelihood, it's with this probability measure given, and we have the complexity of the hypothesis that's given with this small c. Okay, these are the two ingredients. And then, of course, whenever you have more than one parameter for assessing how good a hypothesis or theory is, you always have the problem that sometimes they fall apart of each other. So you have hypotheses which are which make the evidence very likely, but they are super complex. And the other way around, you have super simple theories, but they have the problem that they fail in making the evidence likely. And the question is how you should balance it. And there is, of course, no consensus there, I think, in the literature, but I think you can put forward something like a minimal constraint, and this constraint looks a little bit complex when you express it the way, but I did it here, but the main idea behind it is quite simple. So the principle Abt just regulates these cases where you have a hypothesis which is compared to all its alternatives better in terms of likelihood. Okay, so it has higher likelihood than the others, but not at cost of simplicity. Okay, so if the degree of simplicity of hypothesis HY doesn't fall below the degree of the others, but it's doing better in terms of likelihood, then you should go for it. And also the other way around, when you have this particular case, your one hypothesis is not doing worse regarding the likelihoods, but it's doing better regarding the simplicity constraint, and you should opt for this one. Okay? And for all the other cases in between the mixed case, you have to think about balancing methods, and that's quite disputable. We will consider one of these ways of balancing, but that's something I wouldn't put forward as the theory of abductive inference. That varies. Okay, so that's the characterization of abductive reasoning. Just keep in mind likelihood and simplicity, and you should opt for maximizing likelihood and maximizing simplicity. Now, what's the epistemic rationale of this? And there, regarding the two parts, so if we consider likelihood, the things seem to be quite clear. So from an epistemic standpoint, the most likely theory is also the theory or hypothesis which approaches an epistemic end we put forward quite often in science, namely to provide deductive non-logical explanations in the best sense. So in the best sense, we can provide a hypothesis which allows us to deduce the evidence we observe. Okay, and of course, in such a case, we have highest likelihood. And then the idea is whatever falls apart of this best case of providing an explanation in science is better when it approaches it better. So whatever approaches the highest likelihood of one is also the one which best approximates this epistemic end, and that's why we have epistemic reason for maximizing the likelihood. This is the argument for the epistemic value of the likelihood. It's much more difficult for arguing for simplicity, much more difficult to argue for simplicity. Namely, how does simplicity serve our aim in science? And there the point is, so sometimes just people say, yeah, if we don't put forward a simplicity constraint, then we have the problem of ad hoc explanations, or how to rule out this ad hoc explanation. But then again, what's the value of ruling out ad hoc explanations? We should provide an argument here. And for this point, I want to rely on a paper from the 90s of Forster and Sober, where they put forward an argument from the curve fitting literature. And basically the idea is that complex models have the problem that they're prone to overfit errors in the data, whereas simpler models have less probability of overfitting, and that's what makes simpler models more epistemically valuable than complex ones. Okay. So much for the characterization of abductive inference and for providing a rough epistemic rationale. Now we zoom in more on this rationalizing, maximizing simplicity constraint. Okay. That's the section on value of simplicity. Okay, so I present now a very rough argument, but this should bring, or this should transport the intuition behind it. So the idea is as follows. We start with data which might involve error. Okay, that's what I was starting with. Science has some kind of defects. One of the defects is that that we find errors in the data. And then the second argument is that if we have error in the data and we have a hypothesis which accurately fits the data, then we also fit the error, so we end up with falsehoods. Okay, let's call it a difference. But if we have error in the data and we have some kind of inaccuracy going on in our hypothesizing, then we have the chance of avoiding falsehoods and reaching the truth. Okay? That's all very rough and in qualitative terms. Now we put forward just the observation that complex models are much more likely to provide accurate models. So I can do much more with complex model in order to fit the data. So that would be on average more accurate. And simpler models will be on average more inaccurate. And then we can just infer that complexity as the problem of being instrumental to falsehood, whereas simplicity is instrumental of achieving possibly the truth. Okay? Very rough. Let me illustrate this argument by help of this graph. So assume we have data like given here with these data points, okay, E. And then assume that there is error in the data, which means that the values of the data deviate from the truth outcome. Yeah? So that's something that's not really accessible to us, but that's what's going on in the back. And now we hypothesize about the data and we put forward several models. So for example, we put forward this F5. It's a function with a polynomial degree 5, which perfectly fits the data. Okay? And you have an alternative explanation or hypothesis F3, which somehow interpolates between the data. Okay? It's much simpler. You have less possibilities to fit the data, as it was the case with S5. And it goes in between. And speaking in terms of accuracy, when we consider the data, F5 is much better off than F3. The complex model is much better off than the simple one, simply because the complex model perfectly fits data, whereas the simpler model deviates. For example, here it's coinciding with the data, but here it's in between. Okay. And now, but if you compare what's going on with the simpler model with respect to the truth, then you see that the simpler model in this graph has much less deviation from the truth than the complex one, which has basically all these errors between the truth function and the model. Okay? So if you sum up the errors, then you see that the simpler model is much better off when it comes to truth, although it's worse off when it comes to data. Okay? And of course, this holds for this particular example I've chosen here, because I could have also chosen a true curve, which fits, for example, the data perfectly like F5 does, and then of course F5 is better off, although it's complex. But the point is that if you look on the average of all possible cases here, then simpler models will be still, on average, better off than complex one. And that's what's a famous result of the curve fitting literature of the 60s and 70s, namely that the estimated predictive accuracy of a family of models, so this is a family F5, this is a family F3, okay? And you call it the Akaike information criterion of the model given the evidence is determined by three ingredients, namely first, the number of data points you have, okay? Second, the likelihood, and third, inversely correlated to the complexity of the model. Okay? So you don't need to understand this in great detail. The only thing what you need to remember is that the estimated predictive accuracy. So how predictive accurate are models of kind of F3 compared to models of kind of F5 on an estimated basis, so regarding all possible truth that we can end up here with, depends on the likelihood and the complexity or simplicity constraint. And the idea is that it's proportional to the likelihood and it's indirect proportional to the complexity. So basically, this estimated predictive accuracy measure says that your estimated predicted accuracy will increase when you have a more likely model, and it will decrease when your model becomes more complex, although it might keep up with accuracy in terms of likelihood. Okay. So this particular way of balancing likelihood and simplicity satisfies this constraint I had put forward for abductive inferences before. So if I have two models, two hypotheses, which are, for example, equal when it comes to accuracy, but one of them is better in terms of simplicity than the other, then it has a higher archaic information criterion value than the other. So this criterion is satisfied by that constraint before. And basically, that's just one particular way of balancing likelihood and simplicity for all the cases where I don't have this strict advantage as proposed in the abductive case I presented before. Okay. So I consider this to be the main argument for the epistemic value of simplicity. The argument is simply complex models on average more prone to fitting errors than simpler models are. And when there is not too much disbalance in terms of accuracy, then simplicity matters because simpler models don't overfit. Okay, you're still with me? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now let's come to the third part, to the generalization, because this holds only for this particular notion of simplicity that counts the number of parameters. Okay, so let's consider a little bit more traditional parts of the discussion here. And that's so the main aim is I want to show you now that there are several notions of simplicity out there, and in the end we can reduce parts of them at least relevantly to the one notion we had in the second part, where we have an epistemic argument for. Okay? So if we look at Aristotle, for example, then he states about simplicity and its value in science. Let that demonstration be better which, other things being equal, depends on fewer postulates or suppositions or propositions. For if they are equally familiar, knowing will come about more quickly in this way, and that is preferable. Okay? So for Aristotle, simplicity consists in having fewer propositions and axioms, and the epistemic value for it is that we have a better dynamics in terms of knowledge acquisition, okay? Because we gain knowledge quicker. Here, of course, I mean, if this is an epistemic value we all share and we all can agree on, that the knowledge dynamics, knowledge acquisition dynamics is relevant, then Aristotle has an argument here. If we just care about accuracy and getting to the truth, regardless of how fast, then Aristotle doesn't have an argument here. Okay? I call this form of simplicity, which counts the number of propositions or axioms of theory, the axiomatic notion of simplicity. Then there is another one around, which refers a little bit to Occam's razor, as mentioned before by Yannis. And here the idea is as follows. So Occam put forward this constraint that plurality must never be posited without necessity. I mean, there is some discussion. You don't find this claim directly in Occam, but you find it in secondary literature about Occam. And in particular, what's interesting, so let's put forward by Sober, is that already in the 17th century, you find the expression Occam's razor. Okay? People were referring to Occam. And the razor is entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. Okay? We also find this notion of simplicity to keep the number of entities low in Newton. Newton famously puts forward this so-called rule of philosophizing or doing natural science, rule 1, which states that no more causes of natural things should be admitted than are both truth and sufficient to explain their phenomenon. There we also have a parsimony principle. His argument was that nature is simple, and if you have a model which doesn't map to simple nature, then your model is structurally wrong. Okay, but of course we don't know whether nature is simple or not. I call this the notion of ontic simplicity, and we aim at providing an epistemic value for this notion of ontic simplicity, which doesn't hinge on such an assumption that nature is simple or not. Okay, that's the second notion, and now the third notion, that's the one I think you can identify in Copernicus and the one we used in the second section. Namely, Copernicus, when discussing his model with the alternative approach, the Ptolemaic approach, was that he claims alongside the ancient hypothesis, so that's Ptolemy, which are no more probable, let us permit these new hypotheses also to become known, especially since they are admirable as well as simple. So here he speaks of simplicity, and bring with them a huge treasure of very skillful observations. Okay. And I call this notion of simplicity that he's after the notion of parametric simplicity. Okay. And basically, the idea is it's the simplicity of a model. It's about less number of parameters, and that's the notion behind the second part. Okay. So every one of us knows that this was a very important notion of simplicity that really led to a paradigm change in science. And the problem now is we have three different notions of simplicity. We have axiomatic simplicity, which counts the number of parameters. We have ontic simplicity, which counts the number of entities presupposed by the models of the theory. And we have parametric simplicity, which counts the number of polynomials of the models. Okay. And how do they relate to each other? In particular, the question is, we have an epistemic argument for parametric simplicity, but we lack such arguments for axiomatic and ontic simplicity, because for axiomatic, we just have this Aristotle claim of having a nice knowledge acquisition dynamics. And for ontic simplicity, we have just Newton's metaphysical claim about simplicity of nature. But we want to show that also these notions are truth-apt in the sense we had before. How can we do so? So the main idea is to go with the reductionist approach to show that, at least in some respect, ontic simplicity and axiomatic simplicity reduce to parametric simplicity. And if we can show this, then we can also transform the epistemic value of the parametric simplicity to the other cases too. Let me illustrate how this works. We start with ontic simplicity. We don't need the quote from Newton here. The important point is that, so what Newton says, that no more causes of natural things should be admitted and are both true and sufficient to explain their phenomena. You can, in a toy model, describe it also as you have some fact E, and now you want to account for E by help of an explanation, and you can do so by help of several causes. Okay, let's assume we have a two causes model, a toy model for explaining E, and then we have several causal models we can build upon. Namely, we have one model where we want to account for our evidence with just one cause. Okay, might be C1 or C2. We have an alternative model which accounts for the evidence with two independent causes. Okay. And we have a third model which accounts for the evidence with the two causes, but this time both causes are not independent of each other. Okay, there's some kind of causal dependency here. That's what's expressed with the arrows.
5 minutes for the third.
Thank you. Okay. So this is about somehow the causal models, yeah, one cause, two causes, two interacting causes, and causal reasoning should always be should always manifest itself in probabilistic reasoning. That's at least the modern paradigm. So basically, the idea is that these causal models can be mapped to particular probability distributions, which are about the probability of evidence given the presence or absence of one of these causes. Okay? And I can describe this by help of parameters. So if I suppose that both causes are irrelevant, then I just use a constant parameter. If I suppose that this cause is relevant, then I just add the parameter for this cause. For here, the same for C2. Okay. And if I suppose that both causes are relevant, then I add both parameters. And if I think that they're interacting, then I add also a parameter for interaction. Okay. That's somehow probabilistically mapping what's going on the causal level here. And given this probability distributions, we can have these three models explaining data E. So we have this model where the second cause doesn't play any role at all. That's the single cause model. So you see here is no C2 entering the game. We have the model where both causes matter. So you also add these parameters for both causes. And you have the model, the interactive model, which adds also a parameter for interaction of both causes. Okay. And describe this way what's going on the ontological level. There's one cause, there's two independent causes and there is 2 interacting causes, you can easily recognize that, I mean, when it comes to accuracy, the models will always get better, because here I just have 1 parameter or 2 to play with. Here I have 3, and here I have already 4 parameters I can play with. So I can really fit my model better to the data, which means that I can increase the likelihood of the data given my assumed causes. But when it comes to simplicity, it's clear, I mean, this is simpler than this. Here I just need 1 cause for explaining the phenomenon, and here I need even interactive causes to explain the phenomenon. So for this kind of ontic simplicity, we can just apply the parametric argumentation for the epistemic value of simplicity. And in this sense, ontic simplicity reduces to parametric simplicity. That's the idea. Still somehow okay? Yeah, okay. So now let's come to the axiomatic part. And here's where I really skip a little bit more through, I think. So axiomatic simplicity, I mean, that's a little bit what I was referring to when answering your question. So you can think about axiomatic simplicity in the following sense. Suppose you have evidence, different forms of evidence, and they are correlated with each other. So, for example, if you think about physics, let's say you have here evidence about electric phenomena, and here you have evidence about magnetic phenomena, okay? And now you know there is some correlation going on. If I use magnets, then I also get some electric phenomena. The chances of electric phenomena increase and the other way around, okay? And now suppose I hypothesize about my electric phenomena by 1 particular model, HE, and I hypothesize about the magnetic phenomena about my magnetic theory, okay? And then I unify them by having something like electromagnetism, okay, which provides a unified model for both realms of physics. Okay, it basically shows this is not really a different realm the entities are about. Okay, this is some kind of unification and simplicity, and one can reconstruct it in a way that this form of reasoning about the correlation among the evidence uses less axioms than this form and this form taken together. Okay, if I take my electric theory, my magnetic theory, and put all the axioms together, then it's more complicating in the sense that I need more axioms than if I have a unified theory of electromagnetism. So this is a case of axiomatic simplicity. We can measure this with unified measure, but I think I skip over this. But the idea is that basically, if I have an axiomatic approach, and if the axiomatic approach is probabilistic, then I can also reframe the probabilistic claims of my theory by help of parameters as before. Namely, if I have, for example, this number of theoretical constraints assumed here or here or here, then I can describe the probability distribution, which is constrained by these theoretical notions, by help of this independent number of parameters. So for example, if I have n theoretical notions, then I need 2 to the power of n minus 1 axioms to describe my theory. But what's important is that all these descriptions are independent of each other. So basically what I can do is I can give this description also in form of parameters, as we did before with the causal reasoning. So I can consider this to be a parameter of my theory, this a parameter, this, and all this number one, okay? And then it's clear that if my theory gets along with less theoretical notion, or to account for the same correlations among the data than another theory does, I also need less parameters for describing what's going on in my theory. And in this sense, I can also count the model parameters in the axiomatic case and can reduce the epistemic value of simplicity from the axiomatic to the parametric case. Okay, that's just a very rough outline. So let's sum up what we did here. So we were considering abduction in the simple sense of inference to the best explanation, and best consists of 2 ingredients, namely increasing likelihood and reducing complexity or increasing simplicity of the model. We have a rationale for the likelihood increasement, namely that we, by this, approximate the deductive nomological ideal of providing explanations in science. We also have a rationale for minimizing complexity or maximizing simplicity, namely the case of avoiding error. We considered different forms of simplicity, ontological, axiomatic, and parametric, and we showed how at least some idealized considerations of these two can be reduced to the parametric case. And by this, we get some kind of epistemic rationale for abductive inference, dealing with errors in the data, meaning that abduction allows for dealing with defective data. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have 10 minutes for questions. That's Edna, Octavio, and yourself. Edna, please.
Hi, Christian. Thank you very much for your talk. I learned a lot about managing complexity. But my question comes from the philosophy of biology, and particularly about epistemic issues with huge databases, where defectiveness has different meanings. One of them is very practical, like, I mean, how do you assess that these huge databases have good, sequences, DNA sequences, So the practical, pragmatic criteria that is used basically is which sequencers, which machines did this data, if they come from China or now Korea is getting better, or if they come from these kind of machines, then so I mean, this is the kind of effectiveness that you're not talking about, but you're talking about a defectiveness that is very implicit in reconstructing historical processes, for instance, that, like, for instance, the defectiveness in the paleontological record. And in this case, for instance, the problem is that you may not have the data that you really need to reconstruct the history of a process. And I come to this example not only because I know it, but because you're using this paper by Elliot Sober, and I guess in the context where they are trying to talk about parsimony and simplicity is this, or how to reconstruct this with all this data. So I wonder if, of course, I can't follow all the argument that you're doing because I come from a different tradition, but my question is very simple. How you could call in your idea of parametric simplicity? Because this is a huge debate among molecular evolutionists. So, and this debate, in which Sober is a very important voice, is that you should choose the most parsimonious tree to account for an organism's pathogen. And the problem is that you cannot decide only on the basis of a statistical criterion or logical criterion, but you always end up having to use knowledge that is external to these databases, like geochemical data or paleontological records, or even knowing more about the biochemistry of early organisms, whatever. So I don't see how you could call this I don't think these are like something like auxiliary hypothesis to this thing, but that you end up kind of saying, well, we have 20 parsimonious trees, and then it's not only logical. Different groups are going to choose different trees depending on what is their knowledge more about, if it's about the geochemistry, or if they are weighting more on the biochemistry of these organisms. So these are practical issues. How do you include them in your view of what in this context means?
I allow you to. Sorry. Yes. Now.
Thank you. Thank you. Interesting point. I refer to this paper of Forster and Sober from 1994 because this is, it's the British journal, and this is, I think, which, at least for me, introduced this paradigm change, shift about thinking about simplicity. And Sober, of course, later on tried to provide much more applications of this in philosophy of biology, but also in philosophy in general. So speaking about hypotheses of creationism versus scientific endeavor, and so he has a very general approach. And as far as I can tell from the literature on this, that people are quite skeptical about it. So it's somehow like claiming that Zuber is very often when he's doing these applications, he's oversimplifying stuff. But I think the core is still right and also quite flexible. So the core idea is, oops, I switched to the other slides. The core idea is that, I mean, somehow you want to deal with error, and the curve fitting literature shows you that error plays an important role, namely when it comes to overfitting. But it's not fully determined in the sense that the curve fitting literature says or fixes everything in a deterministic way, let's say. So the idea is basically there is lots of spaces to fiddle around with your models. So for example, we have here the Atocha information criterion, but there is lots of other information criteria out there. There's Bayesian information criterion. There's other ways to connect these two notions with each other. So the way we do the balancing might completely deviate from one approach to another. So this allows for different biologists applying different information criteria, for example, to end up with different trees, for example. So this is one way they enter. Another thing is how to embed pragmatic factors. So one thing is you suppose that there is error in the data. So you suppose there is this difference between the data points and the truth curve. But I mean, basically what you say is there is some difference out there, and then you can say estimated predictive accuracy of this model is better than the other. But perhaps you can do better in as much as you make an estimation how probable is that your data deviates really from the true values out there. And there I would say, for example, if you say that from, I don't know, Chinese sequencing, data is less reliable than data gathered, I don't know, German or UK.
Korea.
Mexican, let's say. So Mexican, let's say, then I would say that your estimation how far the data deviates from the truth is also different, whether you consider data from one lab and data from the other. So there is also some way of fiddling around when trying to apply this approach. In the end, still, I mean, here in this argument, what enters is really these two values, basically. So that's somehow like the logical reconstruction. But I think you can provide a pragmatic reading of these terms, as said when you say that the likelihood here is also influenced by these pragmatic considerations, whether it's from this lab or from that lab. But that's just a very broad answer. Okay. Application is a problem. I think there are lots of critics out there. But the basic or the background, the simple idea still is this. And I mean, I was amazed when I first saw this, some kind of logical argument for epistemic value of simplicity. And of course, it has super many limitations. Agreed.
Okay, let's leave it here. We have 3 more questions. So
sorry,
keep going. So,
right. Thanks. I applaud your effort of trying to offer a truth-conducive argument for simplicity. And now, I have a lot of concerns. Right? Some of them has to do with, I wonder if you, in trying to offer that argument, you back the question. Right? So for example, even the formulation of predictive accuracy, right? It's already assumed that complexity takes away from accuracy, right? In the way that just mathematically, right? Yeah, you're already presupposing that here, because you need to look, the complexity has to be decreased if you want to increase the accuracy.
Yeah.
Well, that's assumed the fair point in question, right?
Yeah, but as far as I understand it, the argument goes, so basically, very roughly, you consider all possible cases of deviation between data and truth, and then you make an estimate on it and compare, given this estimate, what's the result of the simpler model and what's the result for the complex model. and then the complex families regarding this estimate is worse off, and there
Yeah,
I
but
don't
look,
see how complexity.
look at the formulation.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, this is,
Minus complexity,
yeah.
right? You're already assuming that complexity is not increasing the accuracy.
Yeah, but this is somehow, I think this is somehow the result you get when you start with this consideration, what happens if I figure around here the distance is there. So it's not by definition.
No, but
That's not by
you're
definition.
expressing what the predictive accuracy is.
Yeah,
It's
I
an
interpret it this
expression.
way. Yeah.
As an expression, begs the question.
So yeah, but still, it's not like estimated predictive accuracy is defined as this formula. It's somehow like estimated predictive accuracy means something like, so I figure around here, and then I check for each model how well it does. And then I show that this figuring around is proportionally dependent on the log likelihood and indirectly dependent on
Yeah,
complexity.
but look,
I need to cut
All right,
this.
right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm interested in it.
Dinner is almost.
okay, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. So actually, I was, in mathematical terms, I completely agree on that. Like, you have different theories or different models, and you want to choose or pick one, the best one. What you do is exactly to fit this kind of, like, if you're talking about data, you want to fit it, and then you have some polynomial, and probably you finish with a lower degree of polynomial. So, but so I like your presentation in these mathematical terms. What I wonder is about the dynamics of a model. It seems to me that you are like in a static framework, like this likelihood, or the way you're defining this criteria, information criteria, or the way you deduce this, how you arrive to parametric simplicity from an on-tick simplicity. It is in a static framework. By that I mean that because you are based on the likelihood or probability. When you are talking about probability, you have a probability is a measure, and the way you define it. So you have your omega, or your whole subset, or your sigma, whatever you want to see it, and it's a static. It's not changing over time.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can extend that in a dynamic framework.
So the
Or
dynamics would be
You
that
guys just got back to your
Yeah.
question. Okay,
Yeah.
could you put this
Sorry,
to dynamics?
the dynamics would be that more data is gathered, and this leads to a different probability.
Dynamics on
estimation.
the model, dynamics on the data, whatever you are
You want
talking
to
about.
see dynamics there?
Yes,
And
exactly.
you
That's,
just-
so-
that's the main point.
So straightforward
So
answer.
maybe from biggest
That
and
is, sorry,
you
sorry.
are
Allow him just to answer, okay?
Just very quickly, I guess there is some kind of extensions which take into account also shifts in the likelihoods and the complexity by shifts of, for example, or by new incoming data, but I don't know about this. So I can imagine that this curve fitting literature doesn't just stop with the simple model where you have a fixed likelihood function, but it allows also for somehow making considerations about estimated predictive accuracy when new data shifts the likelihood functions, for example, leads to changes in the likelihood function. But I'm not sure whether I completely got
Sorry,
your answer.
maybe
Let's
you can talk
talk about
later.
after.
Could you go back to your abductive characterization?
Mhm.
Sorry, I'm the moderator and I work on abduction, so let me just say a few comments. Well, I liked it very much only because it's very different from some other people. I find it, I have to say, too probabilistic. Maybe if we think of abduction, as you just mentioned, as inference to the best explanation, if I understand well, at least from my point of view, you are separating, let's say, the generation of abduction
Exactly, yeah.
on the one hand, and you are just dealing with the selective part. In that respect, of course, I think this is very interesting. But the point I want to raise is that when speaking of three modes of inference, as you started, at least if we follow Charles Peirce, he wanted to speak of the necessary, the probable, and the plausible. So my question would be, would you like to think of abductive reasoning in the sense of generation in terms of probability?
Actually, yes.
That's my question.
The reason simply there, you're right, yeah, that's pointing out what's going on is like creative abduction and constructing hypotheses. And what's going on here is selecting. I select among the set of given alternatives. But of course, the question in this case is how do I end up with the set of alternatives? And there, basically, I will rely also on adaptive inference in the sense of creative abduction. Now, how to consider creative abduction the same way I did here with IV, or inference to the best explanation. The other idea is, a colleague of mine and I, we have a paper on this. So you can account for creative abduction by help of causal reasoning. So you can show that, for example, if you consider this to be just dispositional statements, okay, this is a dispositional statement which relates this evidence, and this is a dispositional statement which relates this evidence. And then somehow you find out there is also a correlation between this set of evidence and this set of evidence. So what's the next thing to do? And then coming from causal reasoning literature, the next thing to do would be to find hidden causes which relate, for example, these two dispositions with each other, which might be a higher order disposition. And this, and to introduce this higher order disposition, this is an adaptive step in the sense of creative abduction, because that's not something which is available just given my evidence here, also not this lower level dispositions here, but that's something that I introduced due to causal reasoning, thinking about how to best account for this correlation there. So somehow there is a relation between creative abduction and selective abduction. And the way we frame it is also in probabilistic terms, because this is causal modeling, and causal modeling is backed up with probabilistic modeling. That's the short answer and the main idea. Of course, very simplified picture, very many limitations. We just have it for dispositional analysis. We don't know how it expands to Mendel's case, for example. I don't know whether you can rephrase Mendel as a dispositional account. But yeah, that's all work for the future.
Good. All right, so nice. The reference is somewhere.
Yeah, sorry, I hope it's here.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's this paper we have in the European Journal.
All right, okay. Well, thank you very much.
So we have like 5 minutes if you want to